The US Supreme Court is really corrupt. Here's why. The Supreme Court, or as some people like to call it, America's least relatable group project, is wrapping up its current term, and that means that there will be a wave of opinions that will impact the lives of many Americans, like can states ban gender-affirming care? Should ghost guns be regulated? Should Texas be monitoring the porn we watch? I know that last one is particularly important to people. But before we dig into what's coming, I want to clear things up about what the court actually does, because most Americans actually have no idea. Every day I see comments on my Instagram page from people asking when the Supreme Court is finally going to step in and get rid of Donald Trump, but that's not what they do. Let's start with misconception number 1. The Supreme Court is supposed to make laws. No. That's Congress. The Supreme Court's job is to interpret the law, not write it, not pass it. And thank God, because can you imagine if Brett Kickstand Beer Kavanaugh was writing the law?
I drank beer with my friends. Sometimes I had too many beers. I liked beer. I still like beer.
What the court does is decide whether laws and policies are constitutional. So when Congress says here's a law and someone says this law sucks, the Supreme Court steps in and says let's see what the Constitution has to say about it. At least, that's what they're supposed to be doing. Misconception number 2. The number of justices is fixed at 9. This is also false. The Constitution does not require 9 justices. That's just a tradition, like presidential dogs or pretending that the State of the Union is exciting. The number of justices has changed 7 times in American history. We've had 6, we've had 10, at one point we even had 5. Talk about vibes-based governing. The reason we've had 9 since 1869 is simply because Congress hasn't been courageous or creative enough to change it. Misconception number 3. Justices always rule along party lines. Now this one is tricky. While it's true that today's court is pretty predictable, it hasn't always been that way. Historically, justices have surprised presidents who appointed them. Eisenhower called nominating Earl Warren the, quote, biggest damn fool mistake he'd ever made. Sandra Day O'Connor sided with liberals on abortion rights, and David Souter went from Republican pick to liberal darling faster than you can say, make America great again. So, no. It hasn't always been strictly red versus blue, but this court is different. Right now, 6 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court were appointed by Republican presidents, and 3 of them, 1/3 of the court, were picked by just one man, Donald Trump. Trump has as many justices sitting on the Supreme Court today as he's had wives or children he actually remembers. But these weren't just any conservative picks. No, these 3 were carefully chosen and vetted by the Federalist Society, a super conservative group of right-wing legal thinkers who treat the Constitution like a treasure map, and all roads lead to Gilead. But even in this stacked deck, one justice looks like they might be ready to go rogue. Amy Coney Barrett, she's the justice who said that Roe v. Wade was barbaric and said that anyone who wants an abortion should instead legally abandon their child after giving birth. Well, she's recently sided with liberals in a few key cases since Trump's return to office. So what's going on? Is she growing more independent, finding her own judicial voice, or has she just grown tired of MAGA? Or is she just trying to protect herself? We don't know yet, but it does raise a fascinating question. What does this current Supreme Court mean for the future of America? How might she rule in upcoming landmark decisions, especially those about gender-affirming care, executive power, and the basic concept of reality in America? Well, that's what we're digging into in this edition of Here's Why with Kevin Ortega-Rojas. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and for around-the-clock news coverage, you can follow me on Instagram at Here's Why Kevin. Leah Litman, law professor and author of Lawless, How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes, joins me now to talk about the Supreme Court's complicated past, bizarre present, and whatever else lies ahead of us. Okay, I am joined now by Leah Litman, author of Lawless. Leah, thank you so much for joining me. I love this book so much. It is such a good read. Thank you for writing it. I have a ton of questions for you.
Well, thank you so much.
Of course. So your book is called Lawless, How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. How would you describe the vibe of the Supreme Court right now, today?
The big vibe is conservative grievance, which is also in the subtitle. And it's this idea that the modern Republican Party are actually the victims because society doesn't share their views and even criticizes them, by which I mean accurately describes their views. And so that is, I think, a major through line in so many different areas of law.
And then you and I connected on social media after you were on MSNBC, and I shared a clip of you where I said that you make a ton of really great millennial references, and there were even more of them in the book. You reference Legally Blonde, Mean Girls, American Psycho, which is one of my favorite films, and Barbie. Are these references in there to make what you're explaining easier for people to understand, or is it there for fun because, you know, authors also need fun?
Both and it's there so to make the story more accessible and to give people a clear kind of fun analogy to understand what the court is doing. But it's also there for fun, maybe not for fun, but to lighten the mood a little, since the story I tell is not exactly a happy one. But I wanted people to emerge from the book angry, but angry in a way that made them want to fight. And so mocking the justices and the court with a lot of these pop culture references was one way of doing that.
And, you know, throughout the book, you explained so much of the history of the Supreme Court that I wasn't privy to, things that I didn't necessarily know. And I was thinking throughout the book where it was all headed, what your final message is going to be. And I really appreciated the conclusion of the book. Why do you think it's important for average, everyday people, you know, attending yoga class or at bar or, you know, hang out with their friends to understand what's happening in the Supreme Court?
One is, it's just important for us to have an educated voting population. If you look back at some of the retrospectives on the 2024 election, some people blame Joe Biden for Roe being overruled because it happened when he was president. Some people blame Joe Biden for not doing student debt relief, even though it was the Republican justices who ended his student debt relief program. So I think knowing what the Supreme Court is up to and who is responsible for their decisions is a big part of being an informed and responsible citizen. And then eventually, hopefully, we can build a movement that will get us to a place where we have a Supreme Court who believes in democracy rather than being hostile to it.
And in the book, you reference Regina George and the scene in the gymnasium where Regina has been playing victim while she has actually been victimizing other people.
Can I just say that we don't have a clique problem at this school? And some of us shouldn't have to take this workshop because some of us are just victims in the situation?
That's probably true. How many of you have ever felt personally victimized by Regina George?
How has the Supreme Court or the Republican Party been guilty of this? Can you share an example?
Yeah, so there's so many examples I could give about the Supreme Court. I'm just going to take the kind of big example from the chapter where I use Mean Girls as the pop culture motif, and that's the chapter on LGBT equality. So basically what the Supreme Court has done and said is that there is no discrimination against the LGBT community. But when you prohibit discrimination against the LGBT community, that is actually discrimination against the religious and social conservatives who are opposed to civil rights for the LGBT community. So they somehow turned marriage equality into this big affront against religious and social conservatives. So they've turned themselves into the victims, but then they use that to allow themselves to discriminate against the LGBT community. So it's this inversion of equality and discrimination where they just declare that actually true equality means we can discriminate, but that's not discrimination because it's based off of our sincere religious beliefs. It's just all kind of torture logic that, to my mind, resembles Regina.
Yeah. And while we're on the subject of Obergefell, a lot of people today are looking at Roe v. Wade and how we saw that as something that couldn't be challenged because for so long we were told that it wasn't going to be challenged.
Questions that have framed an enduring divide in modern America. One many thought was settled nearly 50 years ago when the Supreme Court affirmed a constitutional right to an abortion. Today, the court answered that question again, this time on a 5-4 vote, taking away what was regarded as a fundamental right. Right now, new laws banning abortion are taking effect in several states, just hours after the court overturned the landmark Roe v. Wade decision, leaving it to states to decide whether abortion is legal.
It feels like a betrayal. It feels like my country doesn't love me and appreciate my body as a woman.
The court overturned nearly 50 years of abortion precedents in a ruling that was a first. Never before has the court granted and then taken away a widely recognized constitutional right.
Where does Obergefell stand today? What are the signs pointing at?
I think the signs are very concerning. So one thing people might not know is that the 2016 Republican Party platform that Donald Trump ran on promised to appoint justices who would overrule not only Roe versus Wade, but also Obergefell versus Hodges. And what the Republican justices are up to now, whittling away at LGBT equality by giving some people the right to discriminate against same-sex marriages or same-sex couples, that's the same path that the Supreme Court took to undermining Roe versus Wade and chipping away at it before they just outright overruled it. So I think they are starting down a course that could lead to Obergefell versus Hodges being maybe overruled or at least substantially weakened.
Okay, and so, looking at the road ahead with Obergefell and using Roe as an example, in the book, I thought it was really interesting. You narrowed in on a timeline that I had no idea about in the way that conservatives on the Supreme Court planned ahead to overturn Roe v. Wade. And they maybe could have done it sooner, but they, planned and they strategized and thought about the politics and the optics of it. And so soon you're saying that marriage equality could also suffer the same fate.
Yeah, so the story you're mentioning about Roe versus Wade is basically the Supreme Court had the opportunity to hear the case that they would use to overrule Roe versus Wade as soon as Justice Barrett was on the court. But they worried about the optics of immediately overruling Roe within months or a year of Justice Barrett joining the court. And so they just held on to that case and pushed it until a later date when they felt, oh, it's not going to look quite so bad that we overrule Roe versus Wade now.
Okay, and so with that in mind, I want to bring one last thing to you that is not in your book because it just happened today. But the Supreme Court today denied to hear an appeal challenging Maryland's ban on AR-15s. I'm curious to know what you make of the statement that was shared by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, where he said that the Supreme Court, he expects, will take up this issue in the next term or two. So is this signaling that they are, again, letting us in on the planning ahead of their decisions?
Yeah, so he's being quite transparent about his plan. And I think Brett Kavanaugh is a real wingnut when it comes to guns. I mean, he's already made clear he would strike down bans on assault rifles. And part of me thinks that a reason why they haven't taken up the case now is Justice Kavanaugh and the other gun nuts are concerned about whether Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett might get cold feet and not vote together with them and might use that case to vote one way and create an appearance of a court that isn't so partisan while they rule on a bunch of other culture war issues in favor of the Republican Party. So I think he and the other Republican justices probably thought, let's push this one off a little and try to get to a point where they seem a little bit more solid.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So, while we are looking ahead at other issues and, it's June, so there are a wave of decisions that are about to come down, I'd love to bring on some panelists who are going to chat with us. I am joined now by attorney and comedian Elizabeth Booker Houston and senior national reporter at Advocate Christopher Wiggins. Folks, we are chatting about the Supreme Court. And so question for the room, are there any upcoming Supreme Court rulings that you are focused on or thinking about?
Yeah, so I do want to clarify that I am not a practicing attorney. I am a lawyer, law grad, but I don't practice. I always make sure people know that, because if you call me, you're going to go to jail. I don't do that. But I do federal privacy law and federal public health law. And one of the cases that I'm watching right now, which deals with a public health issue, is gender affirming care of transgender youth. And that is the Scrimeti versus United States case. Also very personal to me because I'm from the state of Tennessee. I do a series on my channel called Tennessee Tea, where I kind of break down all of the nonsense that's happening with the Republicans in the state of Tennessee. And the Tennessee Attorney General Scrimeti, he is, the name in the case, where Tennessee is essentially trying to enforce a ban on gender affirming care for transgender youth, which would contradict what their doctors and their parents both, want. It's just very interesting that this party that talks about how parents should have all of this authority over their children, what they're learning in school, whether they get vaccinated, all of that, are trying to usurp authority from parents and making the best decision for their child with their child's medical team, and not only usurp that authority from people in Tennessee, but throughout the entire country. So if the Supreme Court were to side with the state of Tennessee in this case, that means that this would open the door for other states to allow these types of bans to pass. It would be considered constitutional. The main issue that we see here is this is a privacy rights violation. And that's what we see with so much with abortion rights, with rights on gender affirming care, is that at the heart of it is a privacy rights violation. And that's something we really want to be careful about as Americans. You might not like these decisions other people are making for themselves or their families, but the problem is when you step into that territory, you're undermining the privacy rights we all have. And so there's no explicit right to privacy in the Constitution. It's crafted from what's called the penumbras of the right to privacy. It's a combination of the First, Third, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments and Ninth Amendments. And that is a doctrine that was developed by Supreme Court Justice Brandeis some decades ago. So it's not enumerated in the Constitution, similar to the right to vote, which a lot of people are surprised is not enumerated in the Constitution. And so when you start going into this territory, you really run the risk of undermining autonomy and privacy rights for all of us.
Christopher, anything over you?
Excuse me. I will preface this by saying that I am not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV, but I do pay close attention to a lot of legal cases. So I am really watching the Braidwood case, which is the case that will essentially decide whether preventative care services like cancer screenings and vaccines and also PrEP for HIV prevention will continue to be covered by health insurance, or whether that has to be continued to be covered without someone having to contribute to the cost of that. And so, that's a case that stems out of Texas. It also, the plaintiffs in the Braidwood case, they had this argument that PrEP, because it prevents HIV, violates their constitutional rights because, according to them, it encourages homosexual behavior, and that was what I guess ran afoul for them, and they didn't want to have to cover that. So that's a case that I sat in the court, and it's not really about PrEP. It's more about how decisions are made around what coverage must be included in your insurance by your insurance provider. So it's not really about PrEP. It's kind of about a technicality, but ultimately, what the decision will do is, if the justices rule in the favor of the Braidwood people, it would take away the care that people rely on in order to keep themselves healthy.
Leah, I had a question for you on the Braidwood case and the way that PrEP was sort of used. From what I can see, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was sort of used to get to the Supreme Court. That's where it started, was this argument over PrEP. So what does that mean? What do you make of them using this issue and religious liberty and targeting PrEP and healthcare for gay men, and then making it this broad thing about pre-screenings?
I think it really shows how two through lines have fused at the court. One is an attack on the civil rights and civil liberties of groups that have not always been fully included in American society. So under that lens, it's no accident that they are pursuing a challenge to, a drug that is used to prevent the spread of HIV. They are using the same legal theory that they use to attack access to contraception, which is it violates the religious freedom of employers who don't agree, with premarital sex or abortion or, the existence of LGBT people. At the same time, it is simultaneously an attack on effective government because the Affordable Care Act, of course, is one of the more popular pieces of legislation because it guarantees people health insurance and it ensures their access to life-saving, health-saving treatment at a price that they can afford. And the Republican Party and Republican justices have long been on the warpath against effective government. I mean, we see that in DOGE, the Department of Governmental Efficiency. We see that just in the approach that the Republican Party takes to government, which is to blow shit up and tear things down without actually having a constructive, positive theory of government. And I think they are using this case as a way to gut a very effective part of the Affordable Care Act, which is to ensure coverage for preventive services.
I had a question for you, for the room, really. We know that Donald Trump, he has 3 of his picks currently on the Supreme Court bench. So Donald Trump, in his mind, thinks that he controls a third of the Supreme Court. And we know that, as I like to call him, Brett Kegstand Kavanaugh is always going to fall in line with Donald Trump. But Amy Coney Barrett lately has sort of been signaling that she may be ready to go rogue. And some people, I don't know, everyone has, I think, mixed feelings about it. Some people don't trust her. What does everyone make of her current rulings and where she's been?
I mean, I think it's self-interest and it's self-protection, honestly. I don't really trust any of them to do anything for moral reasons. And even with Beer Brett Kavanaugh there, he doesn't always fall in line. And the entire reason is their own self-interest and their own power. And I said that as soon as Donald Trump started coming for the power of the judiciary, these judges and justices are not going to go for it. And I think that's really the marker for it. And then a lot of people were surprised with, where she stood on certain issues, especially with immigration. I'm like, well, she's got Haitian children that she adopted. I honestly don't think that it's out of a sense of morality or duty or the right thing. And this might be a really negative way to view it, but I think it's just out of their own self-interest, wanting to protect their own power, the things that they care about. And at the end of the day, I mean, nobody's really trying. Nobody really thinks that birthright citizenship should be gotten rid of. I mean, this is such a crazy thing. And nobody, even with the Planned Parenthood case, which I don't know if you guys discussed that before we joined, but that's the case where currently before the Supreme Court, again, that's another opinion that we'll see come down sometime this month. And that's where they were trying to decide whether Planned Parenthood can be prohibited from taking Medicaid funds, which they keep trying to tie to abortion. But we know that because of the Hyde Amendment, they can't use federal funds for abortions. This is used for things like pap smears and STI testing and birth control and things like that. And, I think that what's leaning them toward potentially not voting with the GOP on that issue, not voting with the potential ban, is they know it's wildly unpopular. And I think they don't want people coming at them for that. I mean, really and honestly and truly, I think it's a lot of self-interest and self-preservation.
I mean, has the Supreme Court ever cared about being unpopular?
Yeah.
Yes, actually, they are concerned because they're concerned about whether their opinions and their judgments will be enforced. They don't have a ton of power without some buy-in from the public. And so I think, the year after the court overruled Roe versus Wade, they had 2 big voting rights cases on their docket, and they basically held off on embracing super crazy, unhinged theories in those 2 cases. I think in part because their public approval ratings were so low. Now, fast forward 2 years later, the court has another Voting Rights Act case on its docket, Louisiana versus Calais, that basically presents the same question they purported to answer 2 years earlier, only now people's eyes are not as much on the Supreme Court with Trump sucking all of the oxygen out of the room. And I think they can now get away with things they couldn't right on the heels of overruling Roe versus Wade.
Yeah. And I will also say just, oh, I'm so sorry, just real quick, is that, they live here. I'm the woman who is Brett Kavanaugh's neighbor and protested outside of his house and made his life a living hell, and his children and, his wife, their lives a living hell. She's in my mom group. Right. They have to live here. And so there's also some personal consequences as well that I feel like puts pressure on them. Like when you're having to raise your kids here and every day they're going to school where not just people here, but I mean, 30% of the nation's wealth is concentrated here. There's a lot of powerful people, influential people here, journalists and diplomats and everything else. When the majority of those people are looking at your kids and saying, your dad sucks, it does wear you down quite a bit.
I think it's that thing for me where even a broken clock can be right twice a day, right? So, and I have this, I have to get over this, but for years, I get encouraged when the court rules in a way that makes sense. And then in June come all of what I would consider the bad rulings, right? The ones that they have been having cliffhangers about all term long. And so, although she does seem to, I go to the court from time to time and observe. I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't have the opportunity because, the cases are televised. But when you go there and you observe, you can see kind of how they engage with these arguments. And what strikes me is that Alito almost always just seems completely disinterested. He just sits there like looking up and aggravated, kind of like upset that he has to be there. And Justice Barrett, she sits kind of at the end, and she, in a lot of these cases recently, she does seem to ask more probing questions and questions that at least seem to have a rational basis to them, and aren't kind of setting up the argument for the right. So from that point of view, I don't think that she's maybe had a change of heart. I mean, although, there is that video that went viral kind of during not the State of the Union, but the joint address that Trump gave, where she seemed extremely disgusted to be in his presence. I'm not sure, how much that means, but I wouldn't yet consider her on the right side of these arguments. I think we need to really consider what they do and not what they say. Their rulings are what matter, not the questions that they ask and how they seem.
Yeah, I don't want to hold you guys too long, but Leah, I wanted to present you with something that you mentioned in your book, Lawless, which I'm trying to plug as many times as possible here. You talk about how the Chief Justice came down on Kagan in 2023 for too strongly criticizing his opinion, nuking student debt relief. Do you think that liberal justices should be more forceful in their rulings or in their statements?
I think this is a really complicated calculus. I think being a Democratic appointee on the Supreme Court has to be one of the shittiest jobs right now, because on one hand, you want to sound the alarm. And I think it is important to sound the alarm to the public about how bad the Supreme Court is. On the other hand, you're dealing with a bunch of snowflakes. And it's just true that if you are too mean to them, they aren't going to listen to you, and they are never going to want to vote with you, and they are never going to step back from the cliff. So they are constantly having to balance between those two competing considerations. I do not envy them. I'm sure I would make a different calculus in some cases, but I'm not sure there is a right answer or magic thing they can do that is going to fix the problem that is this Supreme Court.
Gotcha. Okay, so speaking about, partisan lines, Trump has been, he's sort of starting this public feud with Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society. And Katie, who I was hoping we would be able to get here, she spoke about it today on the Katie Fang News Network, where she was sort of talking about how Trump is very publicly biting the hand that feeds him and sort of telling the Federalist Society, I don't need you. But all of his Supreme Court nominees have been handpicked by the Federalist Society. So what does this riff mean? And do you think that this is going to backfire on Trump?
I think it means nothing. I think what it means is the same thing that happens with everyone who supports Trump. At some point, he will turn on you when it's no longer convenient to support you. It's either, you know, he goes to the Federalist Society, he gets all of his judicial nominations from them, he installs them, he thinks judges are doing his bidding, and then it turns out that that is not actually happening, right? And suddenly he falls out of favor with Leonard Leo. Everyone in his cabinet, they fall out of favor with him when they do something or say something that isn't enough, it isn't deferential enough. So it's, as far as I'm concerned, as far as like covering this, it means absolutely nothing to me, because it's, of course the leopards are going to eat your face. I mean, that's just the case.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
I'd agree with that. And honestly, I think it's really being overblown, because even at the same time, he is feuding with the Federalist Society. If you look at his most recent judicial picks, many of them are still Federalist Society individuals. It's just he's trying to find more hackish people within the Federalist Society. And it is possible to do both at the same time.
Yeah.
The Venn diagram there is a circle, right?
Yeah.
And I will come from the federal employee side of it, because somehow I'm still not fired. Especially being one of the few federal privacy people left after the layoffs, which is wild to me, because I am still very much a baby lawyer. I like just started teaching law like last year. I'm like, I'm so new at this. And so I will say that they're getting the thing with the Federalist Society and all that, whatever. I think something that people aren't seeing, that we're seeing from the inside, from the federal employee side, is the exhaustion from the many lawsuits, especially our lawsuits. We have so many, and they're quietly bringing back employees bit by bit. And this isn't all over the news. This isn't everywhere, but I get an email that says so-and-so and so-and-so are returning in their capacity. Oh, they brought so-and-so back. You know, it's quietly trickling in there because they're feeling so much pressure. And that pressure, especially because I'm at the FDA, and of course I'm speaking in my individual capacity and not on behalf of the FDA, is that the pharma companies and the device manufacturers, they got a lot of money and a lot of clout, and they're putting so much pressure on this administration. I remember the Center for Devices and Radiological Health within the FDA got their people back so quick because the device industry stood up and like got mad very quickly. And big pharma is now seeing their bottom line being hurt because our reviews are slowed down, and, you know, without the manpower we have and all of these things. And I think that is a much better indicator than kind of the petty stuff, the rift between Elon and the rift with the Federalist Society. It's not as sexy, it's not as exciting, because it's kind of this trickling motion, but I think it's very important for people to pay attention to, as well as those companies that have fired the law firms that bent the knee to Trump. I think, you know, that those things are when you start messing with these rich people's money, I think that's where we really start to see the shift.
All right. Well, last question for the room before I let you folks go. Where do you think Democrats should go from here looking forward? I know the Democrats are not in charge right now. I don't know what it's looking like for 2026, but should Democrats steal, you know, the strategy of like a Federalist Society and having some sort of mechanism that vets these Supreme Court picks? Or what should Democrats be doing or prepared to do right now?
I think they should be prepared to campaign against the court and make the court part of politics. I don't think they need a Federalist Society of the left. I think we have wonderful nominees. I think Joe Biden did a terrific job appointing professionally diverse, demographically diverse nominees. What we need is for the Democratic Party to be able to talk to people about the courts and motivate their base and voters about the court.
Before I get everyone else's opinion, I do want to say, while we are talking about the Supreme Court today, I do think that it's important, which again, Leah touches on in her book. I think it is important to remind people to talk about all courts, not just the Supreme Court, even though that's the one that we focus on. Like last week, I was shocked to see that absolutely no one was talking about the fact that Trump on Truth Social nominated 5 ultra-conservative MAGA Republicans to the courts in Florida. Like, it's maddening to me that no one is discussing those things, because I guess maybe we don't see them as important.
This is where the Democratic Party could be doing something.
Right.
Also, Leah, your book is in my to be read pile downstairs, and so I'm very excited.
Awesome, thank you.
I can't wait. Yeah, and I will add on that they got to go to the South. This is my big thing with Democrats right now. As a Southerner, as a Black Southerner, 55% of Black Americans live in the South. They completely roll over every election, midterms, general, whatever. They roll over and just assume that the South is won by Republicans and MAGA has it in the bag. And I'm like, Stacey Abrams in Georgia was proof that they don't have it in the bag. There's so many people down there who won't change their minds, but there's a lot of people who have never felt empowered to vote who can be empowered to vote. And they need to go down in the South and focus on campaigning there, not just in the swing states, not just in the big metropolitan areas, but reaching out to people, especially women. I keep harping that they have the manosphere, right? Social media is on lock. That's hard to fight. What's hard is lying to people's faces in person. And that's why the Republicans are canceling town halls. So what do we need to do? We need to create something in person and focus on women. Like really actually focus on women, not just abortion rights. That can't be the only thing you campaign on, but holistically women in all different areas of life.
Yeah.
I'll just say that, you know, it seems to me that Democrats are still somehow trying to figure themselves back out after the last election. And it does seem like they need to figure it out, right? They need to stop worrying about messaging and they need to worry about what is it they are for and sticking to that. I think, you know, just briefly, I think that Democrats are starting to waffle some on trans rights, for example, and with the Supreme Court already being so hostile toward trans people, or at least seemingly hostile towards trans people, it would seem to me that Democrats need to stick with their support for that community, because as these rulings come out, and if they don't go in the favor of transgender people's rights, they will still need to have allies out there who, you know, humanize their stories and who really bring attention to the fact that the attacks on their rights are attacks on everyone's rights.
Right. All right. Well, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Christopher, for your time. Leah, thank you so much. And to everyone watching, Leah's book is called Lawless, How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. You can go grab it now. I appreciate all of you. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Happy Pride.
You too. Happy Pride.
Oh my God, how did I forget that?